Hey guys, how's it going? Matthxw here. This is a bit later than I would have liked, but here it is. The Shadow Priest M+ guide for the second Mythic Plus season of Battle for Azeroth. This guide will hopefully have something for everyone, whether you're a novice Shadow Priest or an experienced Raid or Fiend. In this video, I'll discuss Azerite traits, talents, stats, and more. As always, these are just what I believe to be the best. If you have a different opinion, feel free to share it. I'll include timestamps in the description if you want to jump around to any specific areas. We're well into the season now, but I'd be remiss to not explain the seasonal affix for Season 2, Reaping. So how does it work? Every 20% mob count up to and including 100%, Consumables will resurrect all the enemies you have killed during that 20% to come and attack you. The mobs will respawn with 50% of the life they had as living mobs and is one of three types: Tormented Souls, Risen Souls, and Lost Souls, all with their own unique abilities, true sight, and a large aggro radius. They are not affected by any other affix. Caster mobs will resurrect as Tormented Souls, and they will begin casting Gravebolt at random players, a long, interruptible cast that is successful will deal 25% of the player's max HP as damage. Some Reaping Waves contain many Tormented Souls, and it is very possible to be instantly global by Gravebolts if they are not dealt with properly. Large mobs, like the reanimated Honor Guards in Untitled and mini-bosses, come back as Lost Souls. A Lost Soul hits for a moderate amount of damage but has two abilities. The first is Shadow Smash, a frontal ability that creates a circle on the ground. If hit, you'll take a large amount of damage and have your HP reduced by 20% for a minute. When the Lost Soul dies, it will explode with Expel Soul, which will fire off missiles landing in green circles after a few seconds. If hit by a missile, you will suffer some damage, be knocked back, and most importantly, do 10% reduced healing and damage for 30 seconds, which can stack. Finally, the standard mobs, which make up majority of the dungeon, will come back as Risen Souls. These don't melee for much at all, but instead apply a stacking dispellable dot that does 2% of the player's HP every 3 seconds. Mass Dispel can really come in handy here. You can skip Reaping Waves if your whole group dies, shadow melds, or drops combat another way. However, all Reaping mobs that are alive will re-aggro when the next wave spawns. So if you skip one wave, you have to skip them all until the dungeon is over. You can skip the final Reaping Wave by killing all the bosses before you reach 100% trash, and this is the standard strategy for most dungeons. As an added bonus or bit of flavor, every time you die, Consumables will mock you. He also can be seen chilling by your respawn point. If a key gets depleted, you can talk to him to accept his bargain, which clears steady debuffs as well as giving you 20% increased damage and healing. It's a nice way to help groups finish keys they might otherwise get stuck on. Overall, Reaping is a significant improvement over Infested in terms of fun and class diversity. There's no longer a major focus on crowd control, and as the affix isn't super deadly most of the time, there also isn't a massive focus on AoE damage, which is a positive for Shadow among other classes. As is tradition at this point, I'll quickly discuss race options for a Shadow Priest. On the Horde side, it's still very open, with most of the classes being equivalent DPS wise and without much in the way of useful utility. Trolls, Blood Elves, Goblins, and even Zandalari now are all worthwhile. For Alliance, things have changed with the addition of Reaping and the way it's shifted the meta of doing dungeons. It used to be Lightforged Draenei, no questions asked, and while it's still a really good option for damage, I found Night Elf to be extremely useful. Shadow Meld opens a lot of options to a group. You can Shadow Meld Reaping, Shadow Meld skip some CC'd mobs, or even drop combat mid-pull to resurrect someone. There's a lot of neat tricks that we done with Shadow Meld that puts it above the other races for Alliance. Nothing has really changed since the last time for Consumables. You want to load up on the following: Battle Potions of Intellect, Flasks of Endless Fathoms, Honey Glazed Haunches or Swamp Fish and Chips, which depends on what traits you're using, more on that later, Battle Scarred Augment Runes, Lightfoot Potions, Invisibility Potions, War Scrolls of Intellect, Coastal Healing Potions, Order Hammers, and Drums. You can also get Hellstones from the Proving Grounds, accessible from the Legion Order Hall, Warlords of Draenor Garrison, or any Priest class trainer. Also a Warlock, but when was the last time you saw one of those? Shadow Priest talents are pretty straightforward, with not a lot of variation, regardless of the Azerite traits that you run. On the level 15 row, we take Shadow Word Void. The other two talents don't really serve much purpose in PvE. The level 30 row is a situational row. 90% of the time, you will take Body and Soul. However, in higher keys or with some specific affix combos such as Grievous, it can be worthwhile picking up Sand Lane instead. The healing it can do with only a 60-second downtime can really help out your healer. You just sacrifice all semblance of ability, so it isn't the go for every dungeon. Wakeress Manor, Templar Cephalus, and King's Rest are all really good Sand Lane dungeons. Intangibility doesn't really have a use as far as M+ is concerned. The level 45 row has been made pretty easy thanks to Reaping. Previously, a lot of the dungeons were a 50-50 split between Misery and Dark Void, where either was a strong choice. These days, things have shifted towards Dark Void being favoured, and from my experience, it's the strongest in every dungeon except Templar Cephalus. Why Temple? To put it simply, it's the way Temple is designed and how the Reaping breaks down. Misery is powerful on the first boss, allows duplications on the boss with a lightning shield, as well as the last boss. A lot of spread adds to dot, makes it quick and easy. It also has relatively small Reaping waves, where it's more than possible to dot everything and get value from that before it dies. Other dungeons have similar Reaping waves, think something like King's Rest. They don't have the innate strength Misery does in Temple. The CC row at level 60 is still relatively simple. Psychic Horror is taken for every dungeon where you don't specifically need the shorter kick city from Last Word, which means Last Word is often only used in Shrine of the Storm. Mind Bomb is still very much useless. Auspicious Spirits wins out in the next row. Shadow Crash is an interesting discussion though. It does more damage in most dungeons than Spirits from my experience, but it costs a global, while Spirits is passive. It's hard to accurately say how many more globals you get to spend on spells that aren't Shadow Crash, and since the amount of damage it does is only 1 to 2% more, Auspicious Spirits is the more reliable option. Level 90 is straightforward and somewhat boring. Lingering Insanity is too good right now to not take, while Mindbender and especially Void Torrent are somewhat lackluster. Same goes for level 100 row. Legacy of the Void is king, mostly thanks to the long Void Eruption cast time the other talents suffer from. Otherwise I could see Dark Ascension having some use. If you're trying to have fun, Surrender the Madness is a fun talent to use, but it's definitely worse than Legacy output wise. So, onto the interesting part, or at least, the part I get the most questions about, Azerite Traits. Shadow has options when it comes to Azerite trait builds. The most popular, and the one you've probably heard about the most, is the Thought Harvester Searing Dialogue build. This build revolves around using one Thought Harvester trait, and ideally 3 Searing Dialogue traits, along with 2 other traits, any of Death Rose, Treacherous Covenant, Chorus of Insanity, Spiteful Apparitions, or Whispers of the Damned. The other traits don't matter too much, the major focus on the Searing Dialogues and the Thought Harvester. These 2 traits combo very well together and allow the build to excel in AoE focused scenarios, small or large. Thanks to the 35% Searing Dialogue nerf that came in early on in the tier, it suffers on single target. Because of this, I recommend running this build only on 4 weeks or lower tyrannical keys. Anywhere below 18 or 20 is okay. Once you get into higher tyrannical keys, bosses begin to become more relevant, and it's difficult to justify the lack of boss damage you contribute, especially if you're running with other strong AoE classes. The next build is what I probably use the most, which you would already know looking at the key videos I've uploaded in the last few months. This build I refer to as my raid build, because it's literally the traits I use for raid. That is, triple Spiteful Apparitions, double Chorus of Insanity, and a single Whispers of the Damned. This build excels at boss damage as well as high HP cleave. The longer the pull, the better it becomes. It suffers on small HP AoE and doesn't contribute nearly as well to Reaping, which is not a big deal if running with strong AoE classes which already handle it quickly. Think Outlaw Rogue, Demon Hunter, or BM Hunter. I like to think of this build as one that fills the weaknesses of the group and makes it more well-rounded. It also helps that it doesn't really lag behind on overall damage. Because you're relying on apparitions to reach their target to deal damage, I recommend only really using this build on higher tyrannical weeks, where the boss damage is really important, as well as high fort weeks, where things just live for longer in general, around 22 plus for some dungeons. There's a third build that some other shadows run that I do not have experience with, as I lack the Azerite pieces to try it out, but I figure it's still worth a mention. That build is 3 Spiteful Apparitions, 1 Thought Harvester, and 2 Searing Dialogues. I'm not a big fan of this build on paper, as I feel it fails to hit the strengths of both of the builds above, and instead sits in the middle, doing a bit more AoE than the raid build, especially to Reaping, but less focus damage as well as more single target than a Searing build, but less AoE. But again, I have no first-hand experience using this build, so feel free to give it a go if you want and see what happens. It's important when deciding on which build to run to look at the level of the key, the affixes, the dungeon, and what other DPS classes are in the group, and think about which areas you can help speed the key along. There's not a simple answer or breakpoint when one build strictly takes over the other, but as I said before, a good place to start is any fort week and any low tyrannical week. Thought-Harvester Syrian Dialogue will do great. Any high tyrannical or any really high fort key, you can see the raid builds start to become more valuable. Stats for Shadow at the moment is a bit different to previous iterations, but still fairly simple. You still want haste and crit above all else, but the weight you give to each stat is a bit different based on the build you run. For the Thought Harvester Syrian Dialogue build, haste is a bit more favoured, and for the Spiteful Chorus build, crit's more favoured. You don't have to min-max super hard here, both stats are pretty even, just slightly favouring one depending on the traits you're running. Personally, I'm a cheapskate, I just run the same stats I run for raid, and it works great. I haven't really spoken about trinkets before in my previous guides for BFA. That's because most of the trinkets were similar, and there wasn't much point talking about it. That's still most of the case, but a few have risen to the top. The best trinket overall is the Incandescent Sliver, as long as you can keep it highly stacked, which is usually pretty easy in keys, unless you have a fellow ranged DPS or healer who doesn't have a sliver, or in narrow dungeons like Waycrest and Total Gore. The next trinkets are all pretty even. Crested Paku, Contra Dark Whispers, and the Ignition Mage's Fuse. I've fallen out of love with the Fuse though, as it's hard to use on cooldown enough in keys to make the best use of it despite its strength, so I tend to use Crested Paku. Conch has a relatively low uptime, but it's still a very strong trinket. Now, onto the AoE rotation. I'll break this down into two sections, one for each of the trait builds that I run. I won't be covering the single target rotation, as I assume you already know it. If you don't, let me know, and I can look into making a raid/single target focused guide after Crucible comes out. First off, Thought Harvester Syrian Dialogue. Your goal with this build is to get as much AoE damage out as possible. Cast Vampiric Touch or Showered Void while things are being grouped up. Once they're grouped, cast Dark Void and get into Void form as soon as possible. Begin weaving Void Bolts in between Mind Seers. Try to only Void Bolt as much as is required to keep your dots up. More Vampiric Touches do not increase the proc rate of Thought Harvester, so you don't want to VT everything, as that takes away from time that can be spent on Mind Seer. On bigger pools, I usually VT things as they group up, at minimum having one up at all times. When it comes to reaping, it's very important to remember what you've killed and where it's going to come from, so you can properly time your Dark Void. Too early, and you end up with most of the mobs not having Show of Pain. Too late, and too many may have died. You want to put up at least one Vampiric Touch on a high HP Reaping or an alive mob before timing your Dark Void so that it hits majority of the souls, at which point it's just Sea City. I'll briefly touch on when Mind Seer replaces your standard abilities in terms of damage with this build. I'll assume you have 3 420 armor level Syrian Dialogue traits for this. If you don't have the same armor level, it's okay. The breakpoints should be similar. First up, Mind Flay. Mind Seer does more damage than Mind Flay on single target. However, it doesn't mean you should replace Mind Flay entirely, as Mind Seer generates significantly less insanity on single target and should only replace Flay early on in Void form or when Thought Harvester procs. Secondly, Mind Seer replaces Showered Void on 2+ targets, but again at the cost of insanity, so you can still weave Showered Voids in if it will help you gain to Void form or maintain Void form on low target packs or bosses. Mind Seer will also do more damage than Void Bolt on 2+, but Void Bolt is required to keep dots up, so it should still be used unless the pack will end before your dots fall off. Now, let's talk about the raid build. This build isn't as basic as the previous and requires some thought with what you do and will take some time to get the hang of. Your damage mostly comes from Auspicious Spirits buffed by Spiteful Apparitions, which requires both dots to be on targets. Similar to the previous build, your goal is to spam Vampiric Touch as things are being grouped up before using Dark Void and getting to Void form. Next, you need to weave Vampiric Touch casts in between Void Bolts until everything with a high amount of HP, generally things that will survive for over 10 seconds, have Vampiric Touch on them. At this point, you'll go into Syrian, Void Bolting, Showered Voiding, depending on the amount of targets. It can come in handy to get close to the mobs of this build, as it helps the apparitions reach their target before it dies, which is a definite DPS increase. Managing Reaping with this build is a bit of a struggle, and I don't have the perfect answer for it. Weaving in vampiric touches on high HP Reaping mobs is important, although difficult with Risen Souls, as both low and high HP souls have the same name. But you don't want to overcast VT, as you lose out on damage that could have come from just spamming Mindseer. I often find myself thinking that I VT too much, and other times I didn't VT enough. But that's why M+ is a group effort. Let your Outlaw Rogue handle Reaping for you, basically. As for Mindseer replacing your standard abilities, it goes as follows. Seer replaces Flay on 2+ targets. It also replaces Shadow Void at 3+, 4+ if using no Whispers of the Damned. Finally, it also replaces Void Bolt at 3+ targets, but the same rules apply as earlier. Only do so if your dots will last until the end of the pack. That's about all I can think of right now. I hope it's helped you in some way. If you think there's something I've forgotten, or something I've said that you disagree with, feel free to comment down below and we can figure it out. As always, like if you liked it, subscribe for more Mythic Plus raid content, and check out my stream at twitch.tv/Matthxw. Feel free to also join my Discord and follow me on Twitter. Links to those are in the description. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy playing Shadow in the second season of BFA Mythic Plus.